Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning as we take you through the results of some recent research we've conducted into the experiences of families who've lost a loved one to fatal road crimes. My name is Belinda Aanensen, and I'm joined by my colleague Lauren Watling from 555 with some of the co-researchers on this project. And we appreciate your time and attendance today as we take you through our research results. Before we get into the results themselves, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today. Just going to click through. Apologies. There we go. I'm coming to you from Melbourne, where the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation are traditional owners, and I know many of you are joining us from the lands of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and communities. And I'd like to extend my respects to elders, both past and present, and any First Nations people who are joining us today. Before we get into the research results themselves, I'm going to hand to Duncan Wakes-Miller, who's one of the co-founders of the Road Trauma Support Group. Duncan's just going to introduce himself and explain a bit about the background about why we're here today. Over to you, Duncan.
Thanks, Belinda. My name's Duncan Wakes-Miller. My son Barney was killed by a drunken, reckless driver. Barney's the middle top row there. He was 17 years old when he was killed in a needless criminal act by a drunk driver. After the tragedy, I came together with other families who were living through the same nightmare, and we helped found the Road Trauma Support Group in New South Wales. We support impacted families impacted by road crime who've lost a loved one, and we provide regional outreach and support services for anyone in New South Wales. We work with New South Wales Police and Transport for New South Wales and the Centre for Road Safety to make sure that no one falls through the net and everyone is captured and helped and supported through the process of losing a loved one on the roads through a criminal act. I had that worst scenario that you can possibly had as a father when you open the door in the middle of the night and a policeman standing there saying, your son is dead. And the weeks and the months afterwards, we went through a terrible process and a challenging process with my other children and my family and my friends in the community. And we were supported incredibly by our friends in the community. But we felt like we were fighting against a system that was not working to help us or support us. There was many things wrong in terms of just being able to fathom the unimaginable trauma that is losing a 17-year-old son when someone else has killed him through a criminal act, and everyone treats it with the ridiculous triviality of it's just an accident. And that's so wrong. And I found that there's a lot of families that share our experience, and we've talked to them. But one of the big pieces for me was that we actually provide evidence for change so that we can not just be the bleating hearts of people who have been impacted, but actually show real evidence that the system really needs changing. And that's how we work with 555 to provide that evidence-based research. So we're going to hear a little bit about that today. There's three things that I think, though, are important, is trying to change the mindset around road crime in the same way that we've changed mindsets around domestic violence. Road crime is not something that, particularly when there's someone killed, it's not something that, having new laws around road crime doesn't impact the majority of people, but road crime is seen as a lesser form of homicide, which is a real shame, because it means that lots of people who kill people on the road get away with murder. And so we need to change the mindset. If we change the mindset, then everyone will reach in and start stopping people behaving badly, driving too fast, drink driving, etc. Legislation is a really, really important part of that. Not just to send people to jail for longer terms or anything like that. Don't misread that. It's really about making sure that the proportionality of a road crime where someone is killed is equal to vehicular manslaughter or homicide. This morning in New South Wales Parliament, the Attorney General, Michael Daly, is making an announcement which is putting vehicular homicide in the same brackets as other forms of homicide with the Charter of Victims' Rights. and some amendments that he's making in that act. Legislation has a big role to play, not just as the stick that is a deterrent. I'm not too sure that it works entirely with that, but just having some proportionality in that to make sure that the gravity of road crime and the impact and the trauma and the riptide that rips through communities when this happens is addressed. And also so that we can address proper rehabilitation. The person who killed my son walked free with a 12-month driving ban after committing about 5 different crimes that night and not rendering assistance to my son. It's very difficult for me as a person in our community, as a father, to explain that to anyone. And this is what we want to do. We want to change the game here. We need everyone's help to do that. And we want to put the evidence on the table so good people who are on this call, who are listening to this, can help make that change happen. I'll hand back to you now, Belinda.
Fantastic. Thank you for those words, Duncan. Before we continue on, I just want to acknowledge, as you may have already heard from Duncan's story, this is a difficult topic to hear about. If anything that you're hearing about today is triggering to you or you'd like to talk to anyone about it, RTSG does have trained counsellors available to speak to anyone who'd like to. The phone number is there on the screen. Please feel free to reach out at any point if you'd like any support or to discuss anything that's discussed today. Okay. So just in terms of what we're going to cover off in today's session, if my clicker will work. No, there we go. There's a few things we want to cover off today. So we'll take you through the background to the research, a bit about the methodology that we've used. It's always important to understand how data was collected or evidence was obtained when we're talking about research results. So I'll just explain to you how we went about this process and the methods that we used. And then I'll take you through the impact of road trauma on our community, the size and scale of this issue, how it affects people in our community. And then I'll hand to Lauren, who's going to take us through the lived experience of fatal road crimes or criminal road trauma. And then she'll go into more detail around what the judicial experience is like specifically. I'll come back in the middle of that section and round that out, followed by a couple of considerations for how we can improve the judicial experience. A lot of what we'll talk about today relates to sort of challenges or issues with the system as it currently stands. So we hope these considerations can be sort of discussion points or thought starters about how we can make some very much needed change to improve the experiences of families going through the judicial process when they've lost a loved one to a fatal road crime. We should have time at the end for Q&A, so please feel free to use that Q&A function in the Teams there, and we'll address questions towards the end of the session. Before we go into the results of the research, I just want to pause and acknowledge a couple of things here. Lauren and myself and our fellow researchers have not personally experienced the impact of road trauma in our lives, which means we are so grateful and thankful to the people who have shared their experiences with us so we could conduct this research. We simply could not have done this project or presented this evidence without their participation, particularly those who shared very intimate details of what is the worst experience of your life. We really couldn't have done this without them. So we want to just again acknowledge and thank those who participated. And our sincere hope is that by sharing their stories in forums like this more widely, we can shine a light on what's needed to create positive change. As you'll see, there's so much that needs to change in these circumstances. So we also want to acknowledge and thank those attending or listening to the recording today. It's only by sharing these stories more widely that we can create that momentum for positive change. So say thank you to those who participated and thank you to those who are listening today. All right, just briefly, the background and introduction to the research. So as Duncan mentioned, he came to us a couple of years ago and said, we've created the road trauma support group. We know that there's so much that has to change. So many systems and processes are broken. Families are going through a nightmare, and that's compounded by all the systems and processes that are broken around them that they're forced into when someone is killed. Can you do some research for us to help us demonstrate the need for this change? So this was quite a big challenge for us. We've conducted to date 2 large-scale research projects that have resulted in comprehensive research reports. You can see the cover pages there on the screen, including one that's just come out in the last few weeks. Those reports are available on the RTSG website if you're interested in learning more. But essentially our goal is to bring together multiple perspectives on fatal road crimes in the community and present back what the whole experience is like. This is the first and only kind of research of its kind in Australia, so we're quite proud and honoured to have been asked to conduct this work. It's really important that we do collect evidence to understand what's going on and the need for change. So to do that, we use a range of methodologies, things like a literature review to see what's going on with road trauma and road safety globally or in other jurisdictions in Australia. in-depth interviews with affected families. So we've done over 20 interviews, quite extensive interviews with families affected to really understand the detail of the experience, what it's like, how it affects people, what we need to do to make change. Followed by qualitative research with experts as well. So again, interviews with experts in fields such as judicial, police, insurance, etc., first responders, to understand what it's like to be a professional in this space and the kind of limitations or things that prevent people from perhaps making change or doing things, making improvements. So we consulted with experts as part of this as well, followed by online surveys in our community. Over 4,000 people have completed our survey, which measures the size and scale and impact of road trauma in the community. So huge, robust evidence base to support the findings that we're taking you through today. So without further ado, I'll get into some of the key findings and just take you through the impact of road trauma on our community. Firstly, this is just a touch on the road toll, the number of people who are dying on Australian roads. And there's a couple of things here that I find really confronting. Just to explain what we're looking at here. So the data is showing from 1970 through to last year, the number of fatalities on our roads. And as you can see quite clearly, that number declined significantly and persistently since 1970. A lot of factors contributed to that, things like random breath tests, seatbelts were introduced, safer vehicle technology, our roads are safer than ever before as well. And all of those factors contributed to a declining road toll. But what's really confronting is that what we're seeing now is that road toll that trend is reversing and the road toll is increasing. So this marks the first year since 1970 that we've had 3 years of year-on-year increases in the road toll. Every year since 2020, the road toll has increased, and that's the first time that's happened since 1970, which I find really confronting, really startling. We need to talk about this more. This is not right. Our roads have never been safer. Our cars have never been safer. What we have now is a mindset and a behavioural problem where people are accepting of risks on the road. It's okay to speed a little bit. You take a risk when you get behind the wheel, that's okay. And that mindset, that mentality really needs to change, because we shouldn't be accepting a road toll in this day and age increasing the way that it is. And another point to make here is just that the idea of this toll. Behind the toll, or behind every single death that we see in this chart, is an entire family and community left grieving the loss of their loved one. The word toll does not do it justice, and the numbers that we're seeing on the screen do not represent the full scale and impact of this issue on our community. And that's part of the reason that our research was commissioned and has taken place. I'll just take you through a couple of numbers here to really illuminate the full size and scale of this issue on our community. If we think about the population in New South Wales aged 18 plus, so adults in our community, 6.5 million, 22.5% of them have lost someone they know as a result of a crash on the roads in New South Wales. That, when we first found that statistic, we were really confronted by that. That's much more widespread than we expected. So 1.5 million people in our community have lost someone on the roads. That could be any kind of crash. When we narrow down further into criminal crashes where someone has broken the law and killed someone else, that's 4.4% of our community, or nearly 300,000 adults. So again, quite a widespread issue, much greater than the road toll numbers would suggest. And if we narrow down even further to those who've lost a close friend or family member as a result of a criminal road crash, we see it's 2.7% in our community, or nearly 200,000 adults in our community who've lost a close friend or family member to these sorts of crimes. So this issue is, again, as I said, far more widespread. It's affecting way more people than we talk about, than we think when we look at that road toll itself. And unfortunately, because the road toll is increasing, as I mentioned a minute ago, these numbers are increasing as well. So if we look at what's changed since 2022 to 2023, the number of people who have lost someone to a fatal road crash, a road crash, is up nearly 11% year on year, which is a huge increase. Similarly, criminal road trauma is up nearly 12%. So these are people who have been affected by someone else getting behind the wheel and breaking the law and killing someone. These crimes are not talked about enough, considering the impact that they have and the size and scale of this issue. This is much broader than we ever thought when we ran these numbers. And similarly, those who've lost a close friend or loved one is also up year on year. So what we're seeing here is a road toll increasing, and that is having a profound impact on our community at all levels. Hundreds of thousands of people are affected by these crimes and these fatalities, and a lot needs to change to better support them. This means that there are more families going through things like judicial process now than previously, which again just emphasises the need to make sure that all the systems and processes, including judicial, are really suitable and supporting people through this nightmare of a situation, and the follow-on processes and systems that they get thrust into. We need to make sure those systems are suitable to support people as they run through. And as we'll talk about now that the system is really not setting up to support people. It's actually causing secondary trauma. I'll pass now to Lauren, who's going to talk about the lived experience of criminal road trauma, and then she'll dive into the judicial experience more specifically.
Belinda. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about what this actually looks like and what it feels like in terms of the human experience. I want to start by kind of calling back to one of the points that Duncan made in his introduction around changing mindsets, and that relates to what Belinda's just taken you through as well. So if we go on to the next chart. Thanks, Belinda. We know that the adverse life impacts are incredibly wide-ranging and endure long after a fatal road crash. Those who lost an immediate family member to a fatal road crime in the last 10 years, we hear that 2 in 5 of those experience a loss of friendships. 89% experience mental health challenges such as depression, anxiety, or PTSD. 1 in 2 report feeling about committing to suicide. 1 in 2 experience a decrease in performance at work or study. And 1 in 4 experience family breakdown. And 1 in 3 experience a loss of faith. So these numbers are huge, they're significant. And I think it really demonstrates the huge impact these events have on people. And I think this quote in the bottom left here really brings that to life as well. I don't see my friends as often anymore. There are things I used to do, like play soccer, but I don't anymore. Or in my husband's instance, his friends come to our house to see him because he can't leave the house. These are truly, truly devastating events, and they affect people more than I think any of us could have ever imagined when we began completing this research. Just to pull out a few quotes, things that people shared with us throughout the duration of our most recent piece of work that really helped to demonstrate truly how immeasurable and enduring the impact of these events and crimes are. I think particularly if we look at the top left one there, my parents were both killed. It destroyed my life. I was completely alone and spent 2 years on the streets. I was 14 at the time, and I spent my whole life trying to catch up. These stories are devastating, and we heard them echoed throughout this research time and time again. And it just shows and brings to the surface that this truly is a topic that needs attention, and there needs to be some significant changes made to the way in which people who are going through these awful events are supported, but also in terms of how we actually deal with and address the behaviours that we're talking about here. So let's talk a bit about the judicial system in the context of fatal road crimes. So I want to talk by, again, referencing this idea of mindset and opening with a thought that was shared with us as part of this research in this quote here. So a car or any vehicle is a deadly weapon, but we don't think about it in the same way as a baseball bat or a gun. If someone misuses any other object that results in someone dying, that object becomes a weapon, and their crime is murder or manslaughter. Why then, when the weapon is a car and the behaviour intentional, are these crimes not considered homicide? Now, I'd like everybody listening just to pause in that for a second and consider the extent to which that mindset may align with your own thinking or those you know. And what are the implications of this mindset? And perhaps a more important question is, where has this mindset come from? And on the next slide, I think we can talk a little bit about what our research has uncovered in terms of this. So fatal road crimes are not seen in the same light as other criminal activity. They're often described as accidents, which frees the criminal driver from culpability. Accident is categorically incorrect. It's not the right terminology to use to describe what we're talking about here. These are not unavoidable mishaps that happen by chance. We're talking about people who are killed as the result of intentional criminal behaviour by another. When we use the term accident, whether in media, documentation, court proceedings, it minimises the reality and the seriousness of the situation, and it perceptually reduces the culpability of the offender, and it softens how the driver's actions are interpreted by people. Accident is a lot more palatable than talking about killing somebody through intentional behaviour. In addition, limitations on local courts mean that punishments for fatal road crimes are minimal relative to the significance of the crime itself. They're treated like traffic offences, which mean they often begin in the local courts rather than the district or Supreme Courts. And this is problematic because of the limitations that the local court has. They can only impose a maximum sentence of 2 years for any single offence or 5 years for multiple offences. So from the very beginning, fatal road crimes are set up for more lenient sentencing. Lastly, we see a high frequency of recidivist behaviours, and it highlights an ineffective cycle that needs to be broken. The evidence shows that repeat offenders are up to 6 times more likely to be in a serious or fatal road crash than first-time offenders. Now, this raises some serious questions about the effectiveness of current punishments and rehabilitation, and it clearly demonstrates that more needs to be done to prevent recidivism in the first place. If we step back a little bit and look at the broader picture, what we can also see is that at a global level, Australia takes a softer stance on fatal road crimes. Other jurisdictions have more specific charges and more severe penalties available to prosecutors. In the USA, for example, vehicular manslaughter is a criminal charge imposed upon a person who causes death through criminal negligence or a violation of traffic safety laws. In the UK, a specific charge, causing death by dangerous driving, was introduced because of reluctance from juries to convict road crimes on the charge of manslaughter. If we look back at home in Australia, we can see that a more softer stance is actually echoed in commentary from judicial experts. Some believe that intensive corrections order is a significant penalty, and there are differing opinions as to whether that is sufficient punishment for committing a crime and killing someone. If you look at the quote there on the right, a lot of people die on our roads, and I think people just take that as a natural part of life. People get into a car and they will have a heart attack and they will run into a pole somewhere, but the criminality side of it is different. It's the most critical portion that must stop. We have to stop tolerating criminals who kill people on our roads. And it's worth noting that whilst we can talk about intensive corrections orders and whether they're significant penalties or not, they're not available as punishments for offenders who have been convicted of murder or manslaughter, yet they're routinely applied to people convicted of road crimes that resulted in death, which doesn't feel like it's adequate. So if we look at sentencing then, sentencing is inadequate relative to the crime, and current punishments are not effective deterrents. Other crimes resulting in death, such as manslaughter, result in jail time. Those convicted of fatal driving-related offences receive much lesser penalties, and there's a direct flow and effect of offenders being charged with lesser crimes, such as negligent driving or dangerous driving, which carry lesser penalties. There's minimal consequence for people who deliberately break the law and kill someone on the roads. Jail time is rare, and sentences which allow the convicted criminal to live at home in their community are common. This quote here, I think, sums up many of the heartbreaking stories that we heard. My daughter was on her way home from school. The other driver was on his mobile phone, sped through a red light and killed my daughter. That's manslaughter, isn't it? But the judge gave him an intensive corrections order. No jail time. He just had to be in home detention. And this was during COVID, so we were all on home detention. In summary, the current approach for charging offenders in relation to fatal road crimes, i.e. lesser charges that receive lesser sentences, means that there's little deterrence for the offender to repeat the same behaviour again, and there's little deterrence for others who see the minimal consequences of breaking the law. The current sentencing is profoundly inadequate. And it's worth pausing also just to consider the reality of the situation when we think about the judicial system as it stands. When a driver is charged with a fatal road crime, the legal team that prosecute the crime works on behalf of the state of New South Wales, not the victim's family. The offender can employ a legal defence to represent their interests in court. They have choice. but the victim's family does not have the same representation. And ultimately, the system is set up to protect the rights and interests of people on trial for a crime, not the interests of victims and their families. And this means that families who were the victims are systematically let down from the start of the process to the very end. And I think this here represents that sentiment very much so. In my mind, it would be fairly straightforward. This person made the decision to break several laws and as a result killed my son. There was no question of whether they did it. The evidence was overwhelming and they pleaded guilty. But then the case took years to come to an end and the sentence they got was laughable. Home detention for killing someone. Belinda. If we look a bit more closely at the judicial system and that impact, what we see is that families are re-traumatized by the system at every single stage of the current process. Despite having killed someone, offenders are usually granted bail. So while families are in the initial stages of utter shock and devastation, they're informed that the person who broke the law and killed the loved one is free to go about their life as per normal, whilst they're left with dealing with the absolute grief and devastation that they have left in a trail for them. The quote here sums it up. "The law is not tough enough. My son is dead and the perpetrator is free on bail. There is so much mental anguish and deep grief. It feels like my son's life doesn't matter. It's all about the perpetrator's rights." As families progress through the system, we see that once charges are laid, they enter a protracted process that draws out their pain and suffering. They expect a quick and straightforward trial due to the undeniable evidence, but instead they're confronted with years of mentions, hearings, sentencing, and often appeals, which delay their ability to heal. They tell us that the hardest part of the whole process was the time frame. They have the facts. Why does it take so long? It's so drawn out. You can't move on. You start rebuilding your life and you get pulled back into it again. Seeing the driver in court was really confronting. I should have taken someone with me. I often went to the court and then to the cemetery, bawled my eyes out with my dad, wanted to get in there and hug him. Furthermore, as we've discussed, the penalties handed down are unfair and inadequate. Monetary fines, community correction orders, they're common. They're manifestly inadequate in light of the severity and the impact of the crimes that have been committed, and they're incongruent with other crimes resulting in death. Again, we've got here a quote that really sums up how people are feeling about this. In most cases, perpetrators are getting off with minimum sentences or even no sentence at all, and often committing further crimes. In one case, there was a truck driver who hadn't had a driver's license for 17 years, and he never had a truck license. He'd been caught multiple times drink driving, yet he's out on the road, and that's how this poor lady ended up dying, being run over by an unlicensed truck driver. Then finally, penalties can still be appealed by the convicted driver. This prolongs the agonizing process, delays closure, and it introduces further uncertainty for families that are going through this process. Re-traumatization is even more severe when the criminal sentence is reduced. So in instances where, as we've talked about and shown, there's undeniable evidence, there's even moments where offenders have pleaded guilty, yet still their sentences are appealed, and they end up with a reduced sentence, which is incredibly insulting for families who are grappling with the absolute devastating loss of their loved one. And again, this quote here, which I just think really sums things up. It will be really emotional no matter what comes out of it. Once the decision is made, that's it. We have no comeback. If they do find him guilty, he can appeal, but we can't. The victims have no voice, no power in any of this. All the power is with the person who has been accused. That is the person who killed my husband.
Thanks, Lauren. I'll pick up from there. So Lauren's just taken us through a sort of high-level overview of the different stages of the process and how families feel let down as they move through a broken system. I'm just going to go into a bit more detail around that, give some more examples of how families feel the system is broken or not set up to support them, and some of the things that need to change to better support families who find themselves thrust into this unfamiliar situation as in a court trial. And I want to make a point around traumatization. So Lauren talked a few times there about how the system currently re-traumatizes people. And I just want to make a distinction there. Duncan's family's experience, and everyone in the same situation as he and his family will tell you this is traumatic. It is undeniably traumatic to lose someone you love because someone else broke the law. That's never going to change. What we do want to change, however, is the re-traumatization or secondary trauma that's caused by the systems and processes people move through. They shouldn't be finding themselves going through years of a court process that only serves to re-traumatize and prolong their suffering and delay their ability to heal. We should have systems in place that support people to navigate these situations, not systems that essentially make the situation already worse, the nightmare already even worse. So that's what we want to focus on today, is the different elements of the system that do cause that additional trauma, and things that we need to do to fix it, because it's currently broken. So the research told us that consistent support plays a really critical role for families. As I mentioned, they get a knock on the door one day from a policeman saying your loved one's been killed. The next day there's a bail hearing, and suddenly they find themselves thrust into a court process that's entirely unfamiliar. It's complex, it's difficult to navigate. Support plays a critical role here, but it's very inconsistently offered. So if you've never been through the judicial process before, you'll find that it's very confronting, it's difficult, it's overwhelming, it's traumatic to go through these circumstances, these court processes. Families are traumatized as they sit in court and listen to the details of the crash being retold time and again, as evidence is shared, as they come face to face with the person who killed their loved one. They turn up in court and they see that person sitting there and have to come face to face, have the courage to come face to face with them. And often, as Lauren mentioned, they have to come to terms with an inadequate sentence that does not currently reflect the crimes committed. As Lauren touched on, the fatal road crimes are not treated anywhere near the same as other crimes resulting in death. The punishments are nowhere near as severe as other crimes resulting in death. So all of these things serve to re-traumatize families as they try and heal and recover from their loss of their loved one. And support is really inconsistent, which just leaves them suffering ultimately. In the most positive examples, which are rare, we had a few positive examples where families had clear and simple explanations of the judicial pathway, what to expect to happen, what's going to happen when, how things unfold. They had regular check-ins with DPP to help them understand how the case was progressing, what was happening, etc. And a single assigned prosecutor who remained on their case from start to finish. So they didn't have multiple people changing hands on their case. So in these instances, which are rare, families do feel more comfortable, they're more in control, they know what's happening, they know what to expect, and that helps them cope with the highly emotional toll of the trial. So it is possible for this system to be supportive, but unfortunately these instances are very rare, and most of the families we've spoken to have told us they felt quite lost and abandoned by the system. And just a quote from a father here: "I've been left questioning everything. We weren't informed, and we are in an unprepared mental state. As parents of the deceased minor, we should be given more information. We shouldn't have to find out who to ask questions to or search online what the terminology means, so the average mum and dad who's grieving understands what's going on." Feeling really unsupported, feeling lost, trying to figure out what's going on when and how to navigate this process. Something that Lauren touched on as well that I just want to reiterate here is that the justice system prioritizes the rights of people accused of breaking the law to the detriment of the victims of those crimes. As Lauren mentioned, there's often undeniable evidence of these crimes having been committed, yet the perpetrator is still assumed to be innocent. So there's things like dash cam footage or CCTV footage, blood tests that show the presence of high levels of alcohol or drugs in the driver's system, witness accounts, crash investigation results once the police finish their investigation, all of which point to undeniable evidence of a crime being committed. However, offenders can still plead not guilty, which forces an elongated court process and drags victims through years of traumatic court processes. This is different from a cold case where there's maybe someone's been killed and we don't know how or when or by whom. In these instances, there is overwhelming evidence of what's happened, and yet the person who was driving can still plead not guilty, which is just very traumatic for families and doesn't really make any sense. The perpetrator has the right to remain silent and can withhold key information. They don't need to even be present in court. They don't need to release information. They have the right to remain silent. And what that means for families is that often they might have questions or there's critical information that's missing from the investigation or from what they know of the crash. And they never find out. They never get answers to really important questions. They're left wondering about key facts of the circumstances and never find answers and never find closure because the offender doesn't have to answer any of those unanswered questions. And the defendant has a right to protract the court proceedings. So as Lauren mentioned, the court process is already enormously slow. It can take years from when someone is charged to when they're ultimately sentenced if they are found guilty. And during those years of process, offenders can repeatedly fire their legal team, which puts the case on hold. We've heard from families who've seen this happen. The offender has repeatedly fired their legal team, which appears to be a deliberate tactic. They're kind of manipulating the system so they can get what they want, which is to live free before sentencing. And we've seen examples of where a jail sentence does seem likely, and that offender will repeatedly, again, even more times, sack their legal team so they can restart the process, just to extend the time that they're living free in the community. So offenders can manipulate things while families are just trapped in the system, desperately waiting for resolution, waiting for that closure for the court process to conclude so they can move on with their lives and with their healing. And we see 2 in 3 families telling us that they often always felt they were battling against a system not designed to help people in a situation. So the system really is broken. It really is set up to favour people who've broken the law instead of those who've been victims of those crimes. 7 in 10 families tell us that they felt the offender or the offender's family had better treatment in court than they did. As we've talked about, court proceedings are highly emotional and very difficult for families. It takes a great deal of bravery and courage to turn up in court and come face to face with the person who killed your loved one, the person who broke the law and killed your loved one. The whole experience is distressing to families because they are consistently made to feel inferior to the offender and their family in many ways. Just as an example, we heard stories of the driver's family being taken to a separate private room to view the court proceedings rather than having to sit in the main courtroom, whereas the victim's family are treated like anyone else in the public who might turn up in court that day. So certainly special treatment for the offender and their family, and that's not offered to victims and their families. We see an incentive for pleading guilty, which just doesn't make sense to families in the face of overwhelming, undeniable evidence, as we've discussed. Often a 25% reduction in sentence is offered if the accused does plead guilty. But when there's undeniable evidence of guilt from the very beginning, and the person who's been accused is going to plead guilty, doesn't make sense to give them a reduced sentence in exchange for that. It's illogical, it's unfair, it doesn't make sense to families who've lost a loved one because that person broke the law. And we also very often see an unbalanced summing up. So the judge will make some final comments before handing down a sentence. And we see time and again, those comments are very heavily skewed towards the offender. The judge will talk about the positive aspects of their life and the impact the crash has had on them, which is blatantly unfair and does not make sense because, yes, the crash has had an impact on the offender, but they're to blame for that. They're the ones who broke the law, who made decisions that put lives at risk and killed someone. So yes, there are consequences for those actions, and it's unfair to skew the summing up to the positive aspects of that person's life and the impact it's had on them, and then pretty much ignore or barely touch on the impact that their actions has had on the family and on the person that they've killed. So we see things like the offender being described as a great citizen, oh, it was their first offence, they've got a family, they're really sorry, etc. But the victim is ignored. The impact on the victim's family is ignored. It's entirely unbalanced and unfair. They talk about what's been taken from the offender, how they've lost their confidence, but again, no equal balance in how the victim and their family are described. Just as a couple of examples from quotes from families who've talked about this exact issue, when handing down the sentence, the judge spent a good 20 minutes talking about the offender, how much their life had been affected, how they were a really good citizen and really sorry about what happened. It was their first offence, etc. Then only 2 minutes talking about my dad, who was the person who was killed. So really unbalanced, really unfair, really difficult for families to sit in court and hear that kind of summing up. And just to summarise this, everything's in the rights of the offender. We had to pay for flights to Sydney for the court cases while the offender had his covered by legal aid. The offender's family were given a little room to themselves to observe the trial, so they had privacy and could be together. But what about us? We're the victims here. I felt so let down. Hopefully this has given you a clear picture of how the current court process is incredibly biased to the offender, to the detriment of families, victims' families. And just the final point here around victim impact statements. So these are meant to be designed so families can give their loved one a voice, humanize them in the court process, give families a sense of autonomy, make sure the devastation they've experienced as a result of the offender's actions is heard and taken into account when sentencing is handed down, and ensure a just response in terms of that final sentencing. This is the idea of victim impact statements, but the reality is not the case. Victim impact statements are traumatic to write and incredibly intimidating for families to read aloud in court. Standing up in court and explaining the utter devastation that you and your family have experienced as a result of the offender's actions, looking them in the face and explaining how they've devastated your entire life is incredibly difficult. It takes a great deal of courage for families to do that, but they persist because they want to give their loved one a voice and make sure that the final sentence is just. In reality, victim impact statements are heavily edited or often blocked by the defence. So families can't talk about things like the offender's past offences, even if there are multiple previous illegal driving offences, they can't talk about that. They can't have any personal opinions in there about what sentence they should receive or what the court should think about when delivering the sentence. And anything that someone might say is even mildly threatening, offensive or intimidating gets cut out straight away. So ultimately, many families report that they write their impact statement and what they really want to say ends up being cut out, and the resulting statement is watered down and ineffective. Just as an example, you follow the rules and write your victim impact statement, then it goes to the prosecutor. They see things they don't like, so they take them out. Then it goes to the defense. They don't like what you said about their poor client, so they edit it too. Then it goes to the judge. They don't like what you said about the court system, so they take that out. By the end, it's no longer my victim impact statement. It's one that's been tampered with by 3 types of authorities. So this current system and process is entirely ineffective. You'll hear in court that defence will use highly emotive language to talk about the perpetrator and the impact on their life, with the goal of swaying the judge or jury to feel sympathetic for them. But families are not allowed to talk about what happened to them beyond stating basic facts. And that is entirely unbalanced and unfair. And again, is an example of how the system really favours perpetrators and really ignores and diminishes the rights of families who are the victims here. So hopefully we've given you an idea of how the system is traumatic to people, re-traumatizes people throughout the process, how it's unfair, unbalanced, and a lot needs to change in this court process. I'll now just summarise what we think are 3 considerations for improving the judicial system as it stands, and then we'll open up for Q&A or discussion. So just 3 considerations, things to think about when we think about how we can improve the current process. The first one is around a lack of dedicated pathway. So there's currently no distinction between broader traffic offences and fatal road crimes, which does not adequately reflect the significance of the crimes committed. And it's a critical factor which permeates through many layers of the judicial system. There's a clear need for focused legislation and pathways for fatal road crimes, which could include a new hierarchy of offences which better reflects the nature of the crimes committed and the impact. As Lauren talked about, other jurisdictions have things like vehicular manslaughter available to them, which we don't have here in Australia. We could definitely consider bringing in a charge like that that better reflects the fact that someone has broken the law and killed someone, similar to how we treat other crimes resulting in death. Again, in relation to offences is sentencing. So we need sentencing which recognises the magnitude of the offence. Again, consistent with other crimes resulting in death. You know, a year of home detention is not offered to people who commit homicide or murder. Why are we offering it to people who break the law on the roads and kill someone? We need a specific review of penalties and rehab for repeat offenders. As Lauren talked about, recidivism is incredibly high in this area. The current system is not encouraging people to change their behaviour after they've been convicted of a crime. We need better rehabilitation of people to reduce the recidivism on our roads. And we need jurisdiction of the higher courts so that we can apply appropriate charges and sentencing. These are not traffic offences like other traffic offences. They shouldn't be going to local courts. They should be going to higher courts so that we can apply correct charges and therefore correct sentencing that reflects the magnitude of the crime. And as Lauren mentioned as well, we need to review the language that we use. The word accident is just simply not accurate and offensive to families. It's not an accident to get drunk, go hooning and decide to Snapchat your way through while you're driving around to show off to your friends and then kill someone. That's not an accident. That's deliberate intentional behaviour where someone has broken the law in ways that we know contributes to risk and fatalities on our roads. That is not an accident, that is a crash, and that is an intentional act. So we have to remove that word accident from our vernacular in these situations. Second point is just around the bias to the accused, which I've touched on in a few areas today. Families very clearly feel that the rights and needs of the offender are given precedence over their own and those of their loved one who's been killed. So the offenders are prioritised over the victims here. There is a very clear need for a victim-centric approach that provides greater recognition of the impact of fatal road crimes, which could include addressing the current imbalance, as we talked about, which favours offenders, for example, their ability to delay trial and sentencing, an expansion of what's allowed to be included in victim impact statements so that victims can fully express the impact of the crime. As I mentioned, the current process results in watered down and ineffective statements that do not reflect the reality of the experience because they've been so heavily edited. So we need to expand what can be included in those statements. And final summations to include as much time reflecting on the victim and the impact of the crime as the perpetrator. We shouldn't be having 20 minutes of how great the offender is and barely 2 minutes of the victim. That needs to be far more balanced and adequately explain the full impact of the crime on the victim and their families, not just on the perpetrator themselves. And just the third and final point before we open for Q&A, inadequate support. So as we talked about, there's a lack of consistent and appropriate support in place for families who have experienced a fatal road crime to help them navigate the system. And we should be giving fatal road crime victims equal access to people, tools and support to aid them through proceedings, just like we do to people who are accused of a crime. This could include a dedicated support person who has expertise in road trauma cases. As we mentioned, these are not regular traffic offences. These are specific, unique fatalities that have resulted from a crime. They need to be supported by people who understand the nuances of these circumstances and can provide customised, tailored support. We need to provide families with clear and detailed information on what to expect from the proceedings and when. So what's going to unfold, who's going to do what, when, what's the timeline for these events, etc. So they can prepare themselves to navigate those different steps of the court process. And we should be giving them access to regular proactive updates on their case. We heard stories of families having to go online regularly to check what was happening in the court that day so they could work out when their case was going to be live, so they'd know when to turn up in court. We shouldn't be making families follow or track that person online to see what's happening and when. We should be giving them updates on what's happening in their case, regular proactive updates. And we should be offering in-person support during all court appearances where a member of the victim's family is attending. As we've talked about, it takes a great deal of courage and bravery to stand up in court or even just turn up in court and face that person who's killed your loved one. We heard so many stories about how traumatic that was, looking them in the eye, seeing them sitting there, knowing that they broke the law and killed your loved one is incredibly difficult for families. So we should be offering in-person support to them during all those court appearances, or in which would give much more support to people who are navigating, as we talked about, a very complex, very traumatic, very difficult system that's very unfamiliar to them. So thank you for your time and attendance. We will have Q&A, but thank you initially for your time and attendance today. We really appreciate you listening to the stories, and hopefully, as we've said, by sharing these stories more broadly, we can start advocating for some of the much needed change that needs to happen. If you are interested in learning more, reading the research reports, they're available on the Road Trauma Support Group website, so please feel free to visit the website. I'm just going to stop sharing screen and open up for Q&A. Okay, see there's questions here. The questions are just loading, sorry. What has made the most positive, significant difference to families navigating through the system? I might speak to that, and Duncan, if you want to jump in, feel free as well. I think it's the support that we talked about. It's helping families prepare for the reality of the circumstances. As we've talked about, there's often undeniable evidence that a crime's been committed and we know who's committed the crime. Families go into this experience thinking this will be quick and easy. It's very obvious what's happened. We have the evidence. They plead guilty, let's just get on with it. But the reality can be a protracted years-long process of mentions and hearings and sentencing and then even appeal. And I think families aren't expecting it to be like that, and for good reason. The more we can help them understand what to expect, when, and how to prepare themselves, I think that will make it, that makes the most positive difference to families. I'm not sure, Duncan, if you have anything different you want to add there, but that's what we've heard. Yeah.
Well, I can certainly say that it's certainly not the office of the DPP, because that doesn't really help too many people going through this process. The behaviour of the judiciary also doesn't help people go through this process, because they often use totally inappropriate language. And they refer to these situations as accidents. And my son being killed by a drunk driver isn't akin to spilling milk on the kitchen table. These things are serious, and they need to be treated as such in the language of the judiciary and the ODPP. And I think the big change has been the fact that we've now got a group that supports people in this court process. The Road Trauma Support Group New South Wales has an incredible number of dedicated counsellors that provide peer support and walk through the corridors up to and inside that courthouse and support people physically in that process, which is traumatic in itself, but also by providing incredible support emotionally to people going through this process. And I think that those support people and the great work that New South Wales Police do in terms of helping people through this process under incredible duress and stretched to the limit in terms of resources. This is an issue that really does need attention, and I hats off to the Road Trauma Support Group counsellors and the police for helping through that process. But the DPP and the judiciary really do need to get their house in order on this issue.
Thanks, Duncan. Just want to encourage anyone, if you've got questions about the research, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A and we can address them. I know there's a lot to digest that we've just taken you through, so people might need a bit of time to reflect, which is also absolutely fine. Just see if anything else comes through. Not at the moment. So what we might suggest is, if you're interested in learning more, please do go to the Road Trauma Support Group website. The research is available there. There's a full report that goes into more detail than what we've just taken you through today. But I do hope that we've given you lots to think about, things that you might be able to do in your individual roles that make a difference to there's a lot to do to make change in this area for families affected by fatal road crimes, but hopefully we've given you something to think about how you might be able to do something in your individual roles. And again, just want to say a big thank you for your time and participation or attendance today. I know it's difficult to find time to carve out for these sorts of things, and we are very grateful for everyone who has attended today or is watching the recording later on. Anything else from you, Duncan, or happy to wrap up?
I'm happy to wrap up, and I really appreciate and acknowledge the great work that Belinda and your team, Lauren, have done on this program. I think it shines a real light and puts some evidence behind what a lot of families are experiencing, and hopefully it moves the dial a little bit so people actually create better outcomes. And so no families need to go through this terrible re-traumatizing process after losing a loved one. So thank you for your great work.
Thank you, Duncan, and thanks everyone for your time today. We really appreciate it. Thank you.